Listen, a retired trail volunteer found a child's shoe on a locked trail. One shoe, clean, laced, sitting upright in the center of the path. The gate padlock was intact, the mud on both sides undisturbed. He'd walked that same path the morning before and it wasn't there. The shoe was tied in a double knot, the kind a parent ties for a child who hasn't learned yet. He filed his report, drove home, and according to the county coordinator who received it, never volunteered on that trail system again. That shoe is a count 7. Before we get there, we need to start with a woman named Carla, a logging road, and a door that shouldn't have been open. Carla was 34 years old when her aunt passed, and the property that came with the death was less a gift than an obligation. 40-some acres in McDowell County, West Virginia. Steep, wooded, half of it inaccessible without a 4-wheel drive, and the other half not worth accessing at all. There was a small house on the lower portion of the land, a structure her aunt had lived in seasonally, and Carla's job was to go up there, assess the condition of the place, and decide whether to sell or let it sit another year. She was practical about it. She wasn't sentimental about the property because she hadn't been close to her aunt, and she wasn't nervous about the drive because she'd grown up in southern West Virginia, and logging roads didn't scare her. She left her apartment in Charleston on a Tuesday morning in October, stopped at a gas station outside of Welch to fill the tank, and stood at the pump while the attendant, a man in his 60s who hadn't said a word while he ran her card, looked at her truck and then at the folded paper map she'd pulled from the glove box and said quietly, "You going up toward the ridge?" She told him yes, the Callahan property, up past the second fork. He nodded once and handed her the receipt. He didn't say anything else. She almost asked him something, then didn't, because the pump behind her was open and another car was pulling in, and she told herself she was reading into a man who was just tired on a Tuesday morning. The thermos of coffee in the cup holder had gone lukewarm somewhere on Route 52. The paper map was folded to the wrong panel, and she'd had to pull over twice to reorient herself, because her GPS had started disagreeing with the physical road about 6 miles back. Not in a dramatic way, just slightly. The GPS showing her continuing straight when the road curved, showing a through route where the trees were solid. She'd driven enough old McDowell County roads to know the satellite data out here could be years behind the actual grading, so she trusted the pavement under her tires and not the blue line on the screen. The radio had given out somewhere on the climb. Not static, just gone. The signal evaporating the way it does when you get deep enough between ridges that the nearest tower might as well be on another planet. She turned it off. The only sound was the engine and the gravel under the tires, and occasionally a branch scraping the passenger side mirror when the road narrowed. She'd been on the logging road for about 20 minutes, moving slowly, when her GPS showed her continuing straight and the physical road bent hard to the left. She took the curve. That's what the road did, so that's what she did. But she was looking ahead of where the GPS said the road continued, because that's where the map showed a ridge. And in the second growth timber between the hardwoods, partially visible through the trunks, she saw something that made her foot ease off the gas. A roof line. Low, dark, the pitch of it wrong for any equipment shed she'd seen in this county. Too deliberate, too residential. Not a ruin, the walls were standing. Whatever it was intact, and it was tucked into the trees at the end of where the GPS road would have gone if the GPS road were real. She stopped the truck. The engine idled. She sat there with both hands on the wheel and looked at what she could see of the structure through the trees. Old timber country has always been full of abandoned camps, coal-era equipment shelters, company housing that got left when the operation moved, hunting cabins that hadn't been touched since the 50s. This part of McDowell County had seen waves of it. She'd grown up hearing about structures that people stumbled onto on ridgelines, and none of it had ever been anything more interesting than rotted wood and old tin. But then she noticed the door. It was standing open, fully open, not ajar, the way a door stands when someone has deliberately pushed it back. And what she noticed, squinting through the truck windshield in the gray October light, was that the undergrowth had come right up to the door frame on both sides, pressing in. Bramble and second-growth scrub up to the threshold on the left and the right, but not across it. The threshold itself was clear. Whatever was growing toward that door had stopped at the line of it, as if the opening were a different kind of space. She told herself it was a hunting camp. She told herself the door had blown open in a recent wind, which was the obvious explanation, and that someone had cleared the threshold at some point, and the growth just hadn't reclaimed it yet. She took 2 photographs through the windshield without getting out of the truck. Then she put the truck in drive and continued on the curve toward her aunt's property. She didn't think about it much for the rest of the drive. She found the house, walked through it, noted the condition of the roof and the state of the well pump, and called her cousin Dale from the front porch while she still had 1 bar of service. She told him she thought the place could sell if they priced it honestly. She mentioned the structure she'd seen off the road, half as an afterthought, and asked if he knew anything about it. There was a pause. What part of the ridge? She described the location as best she could. The fork, the distance where the road curved. We don't really use that part, Dale said. Never have. He didn't say whose structure it might be. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. That was the part she noticed, not what he said, but the absence of anything after it. That evening, sitting at Dale's kitchen table while his wife made coffee, Carla pulled up the 2 photographs on her phone. She remembered the door being open. She remembered it clearly, the way the brambles stopped at the threshold, the way the darkness inside the doorframe was complete, no visible interior even in daylight. In the first photograph, the door was closed. In the second photograph, the door was closed. She went back and forth between them twice. The angle was right. The roofline was the same. The trees the same. The light the same. The door was closed in both images. She remembered it open. She had no explanation for how one of those things could be true. Dale looked at the photos when she showed him. He held the phone for a long moment without speaking, his thumb hovering but not swiping. Then he set the phone on the table face down, picked up his coffee mug, and said that the family had never put anything up in that section of the ridge. He didn't ask to see the photographs again. The account that came in after Carla's was different in almost every way. Different county, different person, different kind of place. But the detail that connected them was the same one that keeps showing up across all 13 of these accounts. Something that should have a straightforward explanation. Something that doesn't. Marcus had booked the cabin in Ashe County, North Carolina, in the second week of November, which is the dead zone for that kind of rental, past leaf season, before ski traffic, cold enough that the owners dropped the rate by half just to keep the heat cycling through the pipes. He was a freelance writer, 31, working on a manuscript that had been stalling for months, and his thinking was simple. 3 days alone, no obligations, cheap enough that he wouldn't feel guilty about the trip if the writing didn't come. He'd found the listing online, a small place off a gravel road with a wood stove and a covered porch and photographs that made it look exactly like what it was. A basic, clean, isolated cabin that someone's grandfather had built, and someone's grandchildren were now renting out to cover the property taxes. The drive up was the first indication that isolated meant what it said. The gravel road off the state route was a 1.5 mile long single lane, with no shoulder and a drop on the right side that he didn't look at directly after the first curve. The cabin sat at the end of it, surrounded by second-growth hardwoods that had shed most of their leaves, so the structure was visible from the road. A small lit rectangle in the gray afternoon, the porch light already on because the management company had apparently set it on a timer. He unloaded his bag, his laptop, a paper bag of groceries from the last gas station he'd passed that carried anything worth eating. The cabin was warm enough. The wood stove not yet lit, but the baseboard heat doing its job. He walked through the place, main room, small kitchen, bathroom, one bedroom, in the way you do when you're unfamiliar with the space, not searching for anything, just placing yourself inside it. The bedroom window looked out at the tree line 20 feet away. The kitchen window looked back toward the road. There was a hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom, short, with a coat hook and a wall-mounted thermometer, and, at the far end, a door he initially assumed was a closet. He made a plate of food from the grocery bag, ate it standing at the kitchen counter because he hadn't felt like unpacking all the way yet, and then sat down with his coffee and the cabin's guest book, which was the kind of thing he normally read out of idle curiosity and mostly ignored. The guest book went back 3 years. The entries were ordinary, couples celebrating anniversaries, a family that came every summer, solo hikers, a woman who mentioned the wood stove twice because she was clearly cold the entire trip. Marcus read through them in reverse chronological order, working backward, and he almost didn't notice the gap. But there was a gap, a clean one. 7 pages, removed with a straight edge, not torn, not worn away, cut. The binding was still neat on both sides of the gap. Someone had taken their time about it. He could tell from the dates around the removal that the missing entries covered a span of about 3 weeks, roughly 14 months earlier. Everything before and after was present and ordinary. Those 3 weeks were gone. He would have set it aside if not for the entry immediately preceding the gap. It was the last one before whatever had been removed. It read, "Do not use the back room. No name, no date, no other text. Just that sentence, written in careful block letters at the top of the page as though it were a heading rather than a message." Marcus looked up from the guest book. The door at the end of the hallway. He got up and walked to it. Up close, it was not a closet door. The frame was full height, and it opened outward, which no closet door did, and when he tried the handle it moved freely, unlatched. It was held shut by a small hook and eye latch on the outside, the kind you'd put on a screen door or a garden gate. He unhooked it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, 8 feet by 10 maybe. No furniture except a single wooden chair positioned in the center, facing the window. The window looked directly at the tree line, 12 feet of dead grass, and then the woods. The hardwoods close and dark in the fading afternoon. There was no light fixture, no outlet, nothing on the walls. The chair was the only object in the room, and it was positioned with a precision that felt less like someone had left it there and more like someone had placed it. He went back to the main room and called the management company. He got a recording and left a message asking about the back room, the guest book, the missing pages. Then he texted the number from the listing for good measure. No reply that night. He moved his sleeping bag to the couch. He told himself it was because the bedroom was drafty, and that was partly true, but the bedroom shared a wall with the back room, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that was the other part. He left the hallway light on. He sat up reading until nearly midnight, listening to the wood stove tick as the temperature outside dropped, listening to the baseboard heater cycle on and off, listening to the particular silence of a cabin in November woods, which is not a complete silence but a layered one. Wind in bare branches, the occasional shift of the structure itself, the faint creak somewhere downhill that he could hear when everything else was quiet. He was almost asleep when he heard it. From behind the back room door, which he'd relatched after looking inside, A sound. Single. Deliberate. A slow creak, the kind a wooden floor makes under weight. The groan of old boards accepting a load they've accepted many times before. It came once, and then it stopped, and then there was nothing. He lay on the couch with his eyes open for a long time. He told himself the structure was old. He told himself temperature changes moved old buildings in ways that sounded like footsteps, and there was a specific kind of sound that old floor joists made when the cold came in hard. That could, if you were already thinking about it, sound like something crossing a room. He told himself these things and believed most of them and still did not sleep well. In the morning, the management company replied. His text had delivered. Their response came at 6:14 a.m. 3 words, no backroom. He looked at the listing on his phone. The night before, he was almost certain he'd seen a mention of a reading room, a small additional space. That was part of why he'd gone to check the hallway door in the first place. He'd been curious about it, but the listing in front of him made no mention of any additional room. Main room, bedroom, bathroom, porch. That was the property. He stood in the hallway with his phone and looked at the hook and eye latch on the outside of the back room door. Then he looked at the gap in the guest book, which was still open on the kitchen table. Do not use the back room. The instruction was clear. It was just that no one at the management company appeared to know the room existed. The latch was on the outside. He kept thinking about that. You put a latch on the outside of a door when you want to keep something in. The account, after Marcus's, came from a man who documented things for a living, which is part of why his submission is so specific and so hard to dismiss. Dennis had been a licensed property surveyor for 22 years when this happened. He was not a man who approximated. He was not a man who misread instruments or confused locations or failed to note discrepancies in his field records. His account was submitted through a third party, a colleague who vouched for his reputation, and the details Dennis included: coordinates, timestamps, equipment serial numbers, state licensing records, are the kind of details that a person either invents with extraordinary effort or reports because they actually occurred. He was working a boundary survey on a private parcel in Bell County, Kentucky, in October. Timber Company had hired him to establish the corners of a ridgetop property they were considering for a logging lease. The work itself was routine. The terrain was steep, and the second-growth cover was thick enough to make sighting difficult. But Dennis had worked worse in worse weather, and the day was clear and cold, which at least meant dry footing on the slope. He was working his way along the northeastern boundary of the parcel when his GPS unit brought him to the coordinates for the property's far corner. There was no corner there, or rather, the corner, as described in the legal description, should have placed him against a limestone cliff face, a natural boundary that would have been used as a landmark in the original deed. The cliff was present. It rose about 30 feet above him, gray and seamed with old fractures, the kind of formation you found throughout that part of Bell County where the geology broke the surface of the ridge. He was standing at the base of it, GPS confirming his position, and there was no survey monument, no iron pin, no concrete marker, none of the physical evidence of a properly established corner. What was there instead was a cleared patch of ground, not natural clearing. The brush had been cut back in a rough rectangle, maybe 6 feet by 4, and the ground within it had been scraped level. It was recent work. The cut ends of the brush were pale, not yet weathered. The scraping had left parallel marks in the soil that were still sharp-edged. In the center of the clearing, driven flush with the ground, was a fresh iron pin. Standard survey pin, the kind Dennis used himself, half-inch diameter, 18 inches long, with a plastic cap on top. He crouched and looked at the cap. Survey caps were supposed to carry the surveyor's license number, the state abbreviation, and sometimes the date. This cap had none of that. It had a 2-digit stamp slightly off-center that read 07. Dennis stood up and looked at the cliff face. The corner it marked, if you accepted the pin's position as a genuine survey monument, placed the property line running directly into the rock, through it, as though whoever had set this pin was claiming a boundary that continued underground. He photographed the pin and the cleared ground. Then he began walking the ridge to look for additional monuments, because a single unexpected pin could be many things. An old marker, a misplaced datum, someone's rough work. But a full set of corners would tell him whether this was a survey at all, or just a stray piece of iron in the ground. He found the second pin 40 feet to the north, equally fresh, equally stamped with 07. The third was 60 feet east of the first. The fourth completed the rectangle, 40 feet by 60 feet, a precise, professionally established boundary, set with equipment that had been correctly calibrated and handled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The boundary described a rectangular parcel. Its back wall was the cliff face. Whatever it enclosed was inside the limestone. Dennis spent 20 minutes on his phone trying to pull the county GIS data for that section of the ridge. What loaded was incomplete. The parcel was visible on the plat, but its deed information returned an error, a broken link where the record should have been. He made a note to pull the physical deed book at the county seat before he wrote up his report. Then he finished his site work and hiked back to his truck. He drove to the county courthouse the following morning. The deed books for that section of Bell County were on microfilm, older records scanned in the early 90s and never updated. He found the parcel. He found records going back to the original land grant. And then he found the gap. 4 years of tax records, assessment notices, transfer documents simply absent from the microfilm. Not damaged, not partially readable. Gone, as cleanly as the pages from Marcus's guest book. When he mentioned it to the county clerk, the woman looked at the screen and said the microfilm had always been like that, which was the kind of answer that is technically possible and yet communicates something else entirely. He was sitting in his truck in the courthouse parking lot, typing his field notes into his laptop, when his phone rang. His supervisor. The timber company had received his preliminary report and had a question about the 5th corner he'd marked on the submitted plat. Dennis had marked 4 corners. He said so. His supervisor read him the coordinate. Dennis wrote it down. When he plotted it on his mapping software, the point fell approximately 12 feet below the surface of the cliff face. Inside the limestone, at the depth where a basement or a lower chamber would sit if the cliff had been hollowed from within. He had not entered that coordinate. He was certain of it. He pulled up his GPS unit's logged waypoints, scrolled to the end of the day's record, and found it there. The last waypoint logged, time-stamped at 2:47 in the afternoon. At a moment, he was certain he'd been walking back toward his truck along the ridgeline, nowhere near the cliff face. His GPS had recorded a location he had not visited, at a depth he could not have reached, at a time he could account for with his own field notes. He sat in the parking lot and looked at the coordinate on his screen for a while. Then he called the State Board of Licensure and asked about the E07 designation on the survey caps. The woman he reached was helpful and thorough. She searched the database twice. The number 07 had been assigned to a single surveyor. That surveyor had surrendered his license in 1991. Not revoked, not lapsed, surrendered, which was the word used when someone filed the paperwork voluntarily, usually because they were retiring or leaving the profession, or, occasionally, because they were deceased. She confirmed the last one. The surveyor holding designation 07 had died in 1991. His name was in the record, but Dennis did not include it in the account he submitted. One more thing. While he was at the cliff face, examining the first pin, he had heard something. He almost didn't include it because he was not certain he had heard it, and he was a man who did not put uncertain observations in his records. But he included it here because this was not an official record. From inside the cliff, at some depth he couldn't estimate, a sound. Low, rhythmic, the kind of tapping that a tool makes against stone when someone is working methodically. The pace of a person who has been at it for a long time and expects to continue for a long time yet. It stopped the moment he turned toward the rock face. He stood with his hand almost touching the limestone, listening to nothing, and then he stepped back and finished his notes and left. The coordinate is still in his GPS unit's memory. He has not been able to delete it. The first 3 accounts came from people who found something and left. Carla drove away from the open door. Marcus checked out at dawn. Dennis filed his report and went home. What made the 4th account different? What made it the first one that required 2 separate chapters to tell? Is that Renee didn't just find something. She disturbed it. And whatever she disturbed didn't stay in the hollow when she drove away. Renee was 29 and had been backpacking solo since she was 19. She'd done the Appalachian Trail in sections over 4 years, had camped alone in weather that would have turned most people around, and owned gear that she maintained with the kind of care that serious outdoor people develop after one bad experience with a failed seam or a wet sleeping bag at elevation. She was not careless. She was not the kind of person who panicked in the woods or let unfamiliar sounds keep her from sleeping. She chose the Creek Bottom Trail in the hill country near the Kentucky-Virginia line for a 3-day trip in late September, a route she'd done twice before. A system of connected trails that followed a drainage down through second-growth hardwoods before climbing a low ridge and looping back. She knew the trail. She knew the sounds of it, the way the creek ran loud after rain and quieted on dry stretches, the way the ridge caught wind at night, the particular birds that worked that drainage in fall migration. She parked at the trailhead late on a Friday afternoon, signed the trail register, and had camp set up in the creek bottom before dark. Tent staked, rain fly taut, cook kit out, food bag hung on a line between 2 trees the way she always did it. 12 feet up, 6 feet out from the trunk on both sides, nothing left at ground level to invite anything curious. She made a small fire, ate, and was in her sleeping bag by 9 o'clock with her headlamp off and the creek running 20 feet away. The first day of hiking was ordinary. The trail was in good shape for September, the creek crossings low enough to rock hop without getting her boots wet. The ridge section offering a long view east over folded hills gone orange and rust with the season. She made camp in the same creek bottom she'd used on a previous trip. A flat bench of ground set back from the water with good drainage and a natural windbreak of a hemlocks on the north side. It was the second morning when she found the cairn. She came out of the tent at first light to start her stove, and it was there at the edge of the camp circle, not inside the cleared area where she'd been cooking and moving, but at the precise boundary of it, as though someone had identified the limit of her space and placed the thing exactly at that line. A stack of stones, 8 or 9 of them, graduated in size from a flat-base stone up to a rounded cap, built with the kind of care that took time. Not a trail cairn. Trail cairns were utilitarian, rough, positioned on rock outcrops to indicate direction. This was different. The stones were selected. The balance was deliberate. She stood looking at it for a moment with her camp mug in her hand. Then she crouched and looked more carefully. The base stone was a piece of local sandstone, creek-worn, that matched the rock in the stream bed 20 feet away. But the stone directly beneath the cap, third from the top, was different. Darker, denser, not a type she recognized from this drainage. It had a chip on its lower left edge, a pale scar in the gray surface, as though it had been struck hard at some point and a piece had broken free. She thought of her grandmother then, which surprised her. Her grandmother had been a woman who kept very specific rules about very specific things, rules that she'd absorbed as a child without fully understanding and had mostly let go of as an adult. One of them surfaced now in her grandmother's voice, clear enough that it almost felt like something said aloud in the quiet morning. "You don't knock those down, baby, you just walk past them." Renee knocked it down. She wasn't hostile about it. She didn't kick it or scatter the stones. She just disassembled it, set each stone to the side, and told herself it was another hiker's trail art, and she didn't need it sitting at the edge of her camp. Then she made her coffee and packed up and spent the day hiking the middle loop of the trail. She came back to the same camp that evening. The cairn was rebuilt. Same stones, same order, same graduated stack, the flat sandstone base, the unfamiliar dark stone, third from the top with the chipped edge, the rounded cap. She stood at the edge of the camp and looked at it without moving for long enough that the light changed around her. She had been on the trail all day. The trail was, at its nearest point to the camp, a quarter-mile away, and for most of its length considerably farther. She had seen one other hiker, a man in his 50s heading out with a full pack, going the opposite direction, who had nodded and continued without stopping. No one else. The camp had been empty and out of sight of any trail junction. She walked to the creek and looked at the bank. The stones of the streambed were disturbed in a small area. A few turned over to show their lighter undersides. Something had been collected from there recently. She looked for the stone with the chip, the one she'd thrown into the deepest part of the channel when she dismantled the cairn that morning. She had thrown it specifically because it was the one that didn't belong, the one that wasn't from this place. It was back in the cairn, third from the top, chipped edge facing out. She set up camp without dismantling the cairn again. She ate without much appetite, kept the fire going later than she usually would, and sat with her back to the creek so she could watch the tree line and the trail approach at the same time. The woods were ordinary. The birds moved through the hemlocks at dusk the way they always did. The creek ran. There was nothing to see. She turned on her phone briefly to check the time. She'd kept it in airplane mode since the first day to save the battery. The screen showed 8:43 p.m. and below the time, a notification, one voicemail, no missed call, no incoming call indicator. Just the voicemail, sitting in her inbox, time-stamped 3:08 a.m. from the previous night, the first night in camp, when she had been asleep and her phone had been in airplane mode, and the nearest cell tower was close enough to deliver a voicemail, but apparently not a call. She played it. Her own voice. Her name, once, spoken the way she said it. Not formally, not the way a stranger would read it off a list, but the way she said it to herself, the particular rhythm of it. Then silence. Then the voicemail ended. She sat by the fire for a long time after that, not moving, one hand resting on her phone. Around 10 o'clock, she heard something in the tree line, not close, maybe 40 or 50 feet out in the hemlocks, moving parallel to the creek. Footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, the pace of something not in a hurry. She held her breath. The footsteps stopped. She exhaled slowly, started breathing again. The footsteps started again, slightly closer, and then stopped a second time at exactly the moment she inhaled. She sat completely still for 4 minutes, not breathing deeply, barely moving her chest. The tree line was dark beyond the firelight. She could see nothing, she could hear nothing. Then, from somewhere in the hemlocks, at a distance she couldn't precisely locate, a single branch shifted, not broken, just moved aside. And then the woods went quiet in the way they go quiet when something large has stopped moving and is simply standing. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the tent with the fire down to coals, listening, and somewhere past midnight the footstep sound moved again. Not parallel to the creek this time, but closer to the tent. And then it stopped, and that was where it stayed until the gray light came. She was out of the tent before full light. Not running, she was too experienced to make noise and too careful to move fast on unfamiliar ground in the dark. But she was moving with the specific efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. Sleeping bag compressed and stuffed, tent stakes pulled, poles collapsed, pack loaded in 11 minutes. She'd broken camp faster, but not by much. The cairn was at the tent door, not at the edge of the camp circle where she'd found it the first morning. At the tent door, the stones touching the rainfly, the base stone pressed against the fabric, the chipped dark stone third from the top. She had to step around it to move. She did not touch it. She shouldered her pack and walked to the trail without looking back at it. She hiked out. The trail gave her 9 miles back to the trailhead, and she covered it steadily, stopping once at a creek crossing to drink and once at a ridge overlook to check her compass. Though she didn't need it, she knew the route. What she was checking, she admitted to herself later, was whether anything was behind her. The trail behind her was empty each time she looked, except that each time she came around a bend and the trail opened up before her, she found another cairn. Not at every bend, but at intervals she couldn't make predictable, sometimes a quarter mile apart, sometimes only a few hundred feet. Each one on the trail itself, positioned in the center of the path where she would have to step around it or over it. Each one built the same way, each one with the chipped dark stone in the same position. They were marking her route out. She counted 7 of them between camp and the trailhead. She did not stop to examine any of them. She did not touch any of them. She kept her grandmother's voice in her head, "You just walk past them," and she walked past everyone. At the trailhead, she got in her car, locked the doors, and sat for a moment. Before she started the engine, she looked at the trail register mounted at the kiosk. She'd signed in on Friday. The register showed her entry and nothing else for the past week. No other hikers in or out of that trail system since she'd arrived. She drove home. 4 hours. She didn't call anyone from the road. 1 week later, on a Sunday evening, she was climbing the stairs of her apartment building after a run when she stopped on the 3rd-floor landing. Outside her door, on the hallway floor, was a cairn. Same stones, same construction. The chipped dark stone, third from the top, pale scar on its lower left edge catching the hallway light. The base stone was flush against the threshold, touching the bottom of her door the way the stones at camp had touched her rainfly. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with a key fob entry and an elevator that required a resident card. The stairwell was accessible from the lobby if someone held the door, but it was a secure building in a neighborhood where she'd lived for 2 years without incident. She stood on the landing and looked at the cairn and did not touch it and did not go inside. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside, sat on her couch, and thought carefully about what she knew for certain. She knew she had dismantled the first cairn. She knew it had been rebuilt. She knew the chipped stone had been returned from the creek. She knew the voicemail existed. She'd listened to it 6 times since leaving the trail, and each time it was her voice, her name, the same flat delivery, the same silence after. And she knew that the stone she could see on the landing through her peephole was the same stone, because the chip was the same, the angle of it was the same, and there was no reasonable argument for it being otherwise. She also knew she had taken a stone from the trailhead cairn. The last one, the one closest to the parking lot. She had told herself it was evidence. She had put it in the outside pocket of her pack and driven 4 hours with it and carried it up to her apartment. She went to her pack, which was still in the corner of the room where she'd dropped it when she came home. She unzipped the outside pocket and found the stone she'd taken. Rounded, creek gray, unremarkable. Nothing like the chipped dark stone in the hallway cairn. She held it in her palm. Then she went to the landing and crouched next to the cairn and looked at the chipped stone. It was not the stone she'd taken. It was not the stone she'd thrown into the creek on that second morning. She had taken one stone. There was a different stone in the hallway cairn, which meant there were 2 stones with the same chip, the same shape, the same pale scar on the lower left edge. Or it meant something she didn't have a word for yet. She put the stone she'd taken in a plastic bag. The following Saturday, she drove 4 hours back to the trailhead. She didn't park. She pulled into the lot, rolled down her window, and set the bag on the ground at the edge of the gravel. Then she drove home. She didn't go back to the trail. She didn't go back to look at the trailhead to see if the stone was gone. She made that choice deliberately, not out of fear exactly, but out of the same practical instinct that had stopped her from dismantling any of the cairns on the way out. Some things you engage with, and some things you walk past. She had learned, later than she should have, which category this fell into. According to her account, no more cairns appeared after she returned the stone. She said this carefully, the way someone speaks when they are reporting a fact they cannot fully trust. The hallway cairn was gone when she came home from the drive. The landing was empty. The stones were gone, including the base stone that had been touching her door. She didn't say she felt safe after that. She didn't say the thing was finished. She said the sounds stopped, the settling sounds she'd been hearing in her apartment at night, the sounds like a stone placed carefully on a hard floor somewhere above her, and that the absence of them was its own kind of unsettling, because it meant they had been there. "I still check the hallway before I open my door," she wrote at the end of her account. She backpacks with a partner now. She never goes back to that trail system. When people ask her why, she says the terrain isn't worth the drive. The detail she came back to, in the follow-up questions passed through the person who collected her account, was the 2 stones. She had thought about it from every angle she could construct, and she could not make it work. 1 stone with a chip on its lower left edge she could accept. 2 stones. Identical chip, identical pale scar, one in a creek in Kentucky, and one outside her apartment in a city 4 hours away. She had no framework for that. She said she had stopped trying to build one. What she carried out was the habit of checking. She checks the hallway, she checks the landing, she checks the stairwell on the way up. Not frantically, just the way you check, once you've learned that some spaces require it. The account that came in after Renee's was the first one submitted not as a personal story, but as a set of written notes, pages from a small spiral notebook, the kind you could buy at any dollar store, with a name on the cover that the person who forwarded them asked us not to use. We're calling him Joel. What he was doing when this happened was his job, which matters because Joel was not someone who invented problems. He was a seasonal fire tower lookout, staffing one of the last manned observation towers in his district, and the work had made him into a person who noticed things precisely and recorded them accurately and did not mistake one thing for another. The tower was in the Cherokee National Forest foothills, in a section of East Tennessee that still ran fire lookout staff through late October, because the drought index in that district had been high enough, 4 of the last 6 years, to justify the expense. Joel was in his 3rd season. He knew the cab, knew the catwalk, knew the view in every direction well enough to recognize when a smudge of smoke on the eastern ridge was a permitted burn, and when it was something else. He kept his logbook current, called in his weather observations on schedule, and maintained the kind of professional routine that made 6 weeks alone in an elevated cab not just bearable but, in his telling, genuinely peaceful. He had been on rotation for 4 days when the radio call came in. It was a Tuesday night. He was logging his final weather observation of the day, temperature, humidity, wind direction, visibility, when the district frequency produced a check-in call. Standard protocol. Correct format. The caller identified their location as Tower 9, gave their call sign, reported their weather data, and signed off. Joel logged it without thinking, because that was what you did with check-in calls, and it wasn't until he was closing his logbook that he looked at what he'd written. Tower 9. He sat with the logbook open and thought about that. He knew Tower 9. It was a decommissioned structure about 14 miles northeast of his position, taken out of service 7 years earlier when the district consolidated its observation coverage. The cab had been removed. The steel skeleton was still standing, or had been the last time anyone mentioned it, but there was no equipment, no power, no radio. There was no one at Tower 9. There hadn't been anyone at Tower 9 for 7 years. He keyed his radio and called dispatch, described what he'd received. Dispatch ran a check and came back within 3 minutes. The district frequency had been clear at the time of the call. They had received nothing. Their equipment showed no transmission from the Tower 9 coordinates or anywhere in that sector. Joel logged the discrepancy, noted that dispatch had confirmed no transmission, and filed it as a radio anomaly, equipment ghost, bounce off terrain, some atmospheric condition that had produced a signal artifact that sounded like a check-in call. It happened occasionally in the mountains, where the topography did strange things to radio waves. He was satisfied enough with this explanation to sleep without difficulty that night. 2 nights later, the call came again. Same format, same call sign. Tower 9, weather data, sign-off. This time, Joel was awake and alert when it came through, and he listened to the entire transmission with his hand on his own radio and his logbook open. The voice was even, professional, unhurried. The weather data it reported, temperature, humidity, wind, matched his own readings almost exactly, with variations within normal range for a position 14 miles distant. When it signed off, Joel sat for a moment and then keyed his radio and responded. He asked Tower 9 to confirm their position. There was a pause. Not a long one, 3, maybe 4 seconds. Then the call sign again, and the same grid coordinate and then silence. He called dispatch. Dispatch heard nothing. He logged the second transmission, noted the response he'd received, noted that dispatch had again confirmed the frequency clear. After he filed that log entry, he went to the catwalk and looked northeast for a long time in the dark. 14 miles in clear air, with no intervening terrain at the right elevation, a fire tower's light was sometimes visible. He saw nothing. The ridgeline in that direction was black and unbroken. 20 minutes after he came back inside, the exterior motion light activated. The motion light was mounted below the cab on the tower's main platform, positioned to illuminate anyone coming up the stairs after dark. It ran on a 30-second timer, triggered by movement, stayed on for half a minute, then cut off if nothing else activated it. Joel looked at the light through the cab floor's observation window. The stairs below him were empty. The platform was empty. The light stayed on for 11 minutes without a single reset trigger, burning steadily in the dark below him, and then it went out. He did not go down to check the platform that night. The following morning, he descended to perform his daily exterior check, which included the visitor log kept at the tower's base for hikers who climbed the public observation stairs. The log was a standard spiral-bound notebook in a weatherproof box mounted on the tower's base frame. Joel checked it every few days as part of his routine. The last entry before yesterday had been 2 hikers on a Saturday afternoon, 11 days ago. There was a new entry, yesterday's date, written in neat, upright handwriting, the kind of handwriting that had been taught with a ruler and taken seriously. In the name field, Tower 9. In the comment field, nothing. He stood at the base of the tower in the morning cold and looked at that entry for a while. Then he photographed it with the small personal camera he carried for documentation, closed the box, and climbed back up to the cab. He called the district office when he had his morning radio window. He reached a ranger he'd worked with for 2 seasons, a careful and experienced man named Garrett who was not given to drama. Joel described the radio calls, the motion light, the log entry. He asked what Garrett knew about Tower 9. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Tower 9 had been decommissioned following an incident in 1997. A lookout had gone missing from the post. The case had been listed as a voluntary abandonment. The official position was that the lookout had simply left, walked off the job, which did happen occasionally and was not as strange as it sounded in a job that isolated a person for weeks at a time. Joel asked for the lookout's name. Garrett said he didn't have that information available. His voice was careful in the way that voices are careful when someone has more information than they're choosing to share. That night, past midnight, Joel went back to the visitor log. He had been thinking about it all day, about the entry, about the handwriting. He opened the box and turned back through the pages, not looking at the recent entries, but going further, going back. He was looking for something and he wasn't sure what. He found it near the back of the book, in a section of older entries from when the log had apparently been used at a previous location or time, pages that had been placed in this log without anyone thinking to remove them. An entry in the same upright, careful handwriting. The name, Field, Tower 9. The date, Field. A Tuesday in August 1994. 3 years before the lookout disappeared. Joel's supervisor approved his early departure request without the usual 2-week administrative window. The approval came back the same day he filed it, with a single non-standard line in the reply email. Don't worry about the log. He packed his gear on his final night in the cab. The radio was quiet. The motion light activated once, at 2:47 in the morning, and stayed on for its standard 30 seconds, and then went off. Joel sat in his chair with his logbook closed on the table in front of him, and did not go to the observation window to look down at the platform. He didn't look. He's thought about that since. He doesn't have a clean explanation for why he didn't look, except that somewhere in the 5 days between the first radio call and that last night in the cab, some part of his professional instinct had been replaced by something older and quieter that understood, without being able to say why, that looking was the wrong choice. The next account is different from the others in one specific way. Every account so far belonged to someone who went somewhere, a ridge, a trail, a tower, a cabin in the woods. Patsy didn't go anywhere. She drove the same road she'd driven 5 days a week for 23 years, and the road brought the discovery to her. Patsy had been a rural mail carrier in Buchanan County, Virginia, for most of her working life. She knew her route the way some people know a piece of music. Not just the sequence of it, but the texture, the particular characteristics of each section, the way the light hit the road on a winter morning versus a summer afternoon, which dogs would come to the box and which would stay on the porch, which families put their flags up on delivery days and which ones never did. She knew when something on her route was different. That was not a skill she'd developed. It was something that happened naturally over 23 years of looking at the same thing every day. On a Tuesday morning in March, she turned onto the long stretch of state route that formed the middle section of her route. A 2-lane road running between 2 ridges, about 4 miles of it with houses spread out every quarter mile or so, and saw a mailbox she had never seen before. It was positioned between 2 properties she knew well, the Gentry place on the left and the Combs place on the right, both families she'd been delivering to for the better part of 2 decades. Both properties with their boundaries clearly marked and their boxes long established at the road's edge. Between them, set on a fresh-cut wooden post with the raw wood still pale and unseasoned, was a new galvanized mailbox. Rural style, standard size, the flag down. The post had been set in what looked like recently disturbed gravel, the surface around its base still loose, not yet compacted by traffic or weather. Patsy slowed and checked her route sheet. The address number on the box, she'd noted it when she passed, did not appear in her database. There was no listing for a new delivery point on that section. New rural addresses required county assignment, postal service notification, a physical inspection of the access point. None of that had happened. She would have known. She stopped at the Gentry box 50 feet up the road, delivered their mail, and on her way back past the new box, she slowed again and looked at it more carefully. The flag was down. The door was closed. She did not open it because it was not an active delivery point in her system, which meant it was not her box to open. She mentioned it to the postmaster when she returned to the station that afternoon. He pulled up the county address database on his computer and searched the property section where she described it. Nothing. He called the county assessor's office, who confirmed that no new address had been issued for that stretch of road. He said he'd look into it and told her to continue skipping it until it was properly registered. The box was still there the following morning, and the morning after that. On the 3rd morning, there was mail in it. She saw the flag was up before she even reached it, and she slowed automatically because that was what you did when a flag was up. Someone had an outgoing piece. But when she stopped and opened the box, what she found was not outgoing mail. It was a single envelope, no stamp, no postmark, no return address. The envelope was addressed in neat handwriting, the same upright, careful hand to the one who finds this first. She held it for a moment. Then she opened it, because she was practical and because she was alone on a county road in March with no one to ask, and because 23 years of rural mail work had given her a specific kind of judgment about when something required immediate attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, drawn in pencil with a steady and confident hand, was a map. Her route. The entire thing. Every road, every bend, every delivery point, every driveway, every structure set back from the pavement. The accuracy was not approximate, it was exact. The Gentry mailbox was in the right place. The Combs mailbox was in the right place. The distances between points were correct to within what felt like a few feet. The creek crossing at mile 3 was shown with the right angle. The ridge above the 4th section was rendered with enough topographic detail to be useful. At the end of the route, past her last delivery, past the section where she turned around and headed back, there was a turnoff marked with a small X. Not a road she recognized. Not an intersection that appeared on her paper map or on the county route sheets she kept in the vehicle. A turnoff that, according to this map, existed at a specific point along a stretch of road she'd driven 10,000 times. She drove to that section of the route that afternoon. She drove slowly. She looked at the right side of the road where the X indicated a turnoff. There was a break in the tree line. Not a road, not a driveway, not a maintained access point, but a gap, old and overgrown. The kind of opening that a road left behind when it had been closed long enough for brush to reclaim the edges, but not long enough for the trees to fully close in. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't see it. If you were looking for it, you could see it had been a road once. She did not turn in. She sat with her engine running and looked at the gap in the tree line for a minute, then drove back to the station. She showed the map to the postmaster the following morning. He was a man she'd worked with for 11 years, a calm and sensible person who approached problems methodically. He took the map and looked at it for what she estimated was 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he looked up at her. "Don't drive to that X," he said. She asked him why. He folded the map carefully along its existing creases and handed it back to her. He said he didn't know exactly. He said there were parts of this county that people had always understood not to engage with, and that the stretch of road near that turnoff was one of them, and that he'd always taken that understanding as the kind of practical local knowledge you didn't need a specific reason for. He was not a superstitious man. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady when he handed the map back. She asked around. Not loudly, not in a way that would draw attention. She was a 23-year veteran of a county route, and she understood how to ask things quietly. 3 people she showed the map to looked at it and handed it back without comment. Not rudely, just without comment, the way you handle something you've been taught not to engage with. The 4th person was a retired deputy named Carver, who had worked Buchanan County for 30 years before his retirement. He looked at the map for a long time, and then he told her that the turnoff led to a hollow that the county had condemned and purchased outright in 1988. Every parcel in it, every structure. The county had bought the whole thing, and the documentation said no habitable structures remained. He said this in the deliberate tone of a man reciting something he'd been told to believe. Not lying, she was sure of that. Just repeating the official position with the care of someone who had decided, at some point, that the official position was the safest thing to carry. On the 4th morning, the mailbox was gone. Post, hardware, and all. The gravel where the post had been set was undisturbed, settled and flat, as though nothing had ever been placed there. She stopped and got out of her vehicle and looked at the spot for a while. No holes, no marks from a post puller, no loose gravel, no disturbed edge. The box had arrived and departed without leaving evidence of either. The map was still in her glove box. She thought about throwing it away and didn't. She thought about showing it to someone else and didn't. She drove her route and kept her eyes on the road where the X was, and drove past it every day without turning in. And after a while, the gap in the tree line became just another feature of the road she knew well. She kept the map in a lockbox at the post office when she retired. Not at home. At the station, in the lockbox where she kept her route documentation and her mileage logs, and the things that belonged to the job rather than to her. When the person collecting these accounts asked why she kept it there and not at home, she said she didn't want it in the house. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Someone had made that map from inside her vehicle, or from the road directly beside it. There was no other explanation for the accuracy, the specific distances, the angle of the creek crossing, the details that were only visible from the seat of a delivery vehicle moving at route speed. She was always alone on that road. She had been alone on it for 23 years. That account came from a woman who spent 2 decades on the same road and never found an explanation that covered every detail. This next one, account 7, is the one I mentioned at the beginning. It belongs to a man named Gideon, and it's the one that has stayed with me the longest. I think it'll stay with you too. Gideon was 67 years old, a retired school principal, and he had been volunteering with his county's trail system in Clay County, Kentucky, for 6 years when this happened. He was not a man who exaggerated. The people who worked with him described him consistently as methodical, thorough, and calm under difficult conditions. Qualities that had served him well as a school administrator and served him equally well on the trail system, where his primary responsibilities were maintenance checks, closure management, and incident documentation. He had assisted on 2 search and rescue operations during his time as a volunteer. He knew what a difficult situation looked like, and he knew how to move through one without losing his footing. The trail had been gated and locked 11 days earlier, following the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl named Lily Marsh. Lily had gone missing on a Saturday afternoon during a family hike on the lower section of the trail system. The easy section, the maintained section, the part that the county promoted for families with young children. The family had been on a wide, well-marked path in clear weather. Lily had been walking ahead of her parents and her older brother, visible in the open. And then she was not visible. The family searched for 40 minutes before calling emergency services, and the search that followed, 3 days of organized grid work, 2 more days of volunteer effort, and another day of aerial coverage, produced nothing. No sign of Lily, no trail, no evidence of where she had gone or in what direction. The case remained open. The trail had been gated pending review of the search documentation. Gideon's job, 11 days after the closure, was to walk the length of the gated section to check the condition of the closure signage, confirm the padlocks were intact, and document any weather damage from a storm that had come through 4 days earlier. Routine work. Necessary work. The kind of task that fell to the most reliable volunteers, because it needed to be done correctly and completely. He arrived at the lower gate at 7 in the morning. The padlock was intact. He checked it first before he logged anything else, because the condition of the lock was the first item on his documentation sheet. Intact, no signs of tampering, the chain seated correctly through the gate frame. He photographed it, logged it, and began his walk of the closure. The morning was cold and overcast, the kind of flat gray October light that made distances hard to read. The trail surface was soft from the recent storm, which was useful for his purposes. Any footprints from after the closure would be visible, and the condition of the trail markers could be assessed more accurately on a damp surface. He moved at a measured pace, making notes, photographing sections where the storm had brought debris across the path. He was approximately a quarter mile in when he saw it. In the center of the trail, a child's shoe. He stopped walking. He did not approach it immediately. He stood where he was and looked at it from a distance of about 15 feet, and the first thing he noted, because he was a methodical man and noting things was what he did, was that it was upright, not lying on its side the way a shoe falls when it drops from a foot, not pushed against the trail edge by water or wind. Upright, in the center of the path, positioned as deliberately as you would position a shoe if you were placing it rather than losing it. He looked at the trail surface around it, mud, soft and even from the rain. No footprints in the mud. Not approaching the shoe, not leading away from it, not circling it. The shoe was sitting on undisturbed mud as though it had been lowered from directly above and set down with care. He photographed it from where he stood. Then he moved closer, step by careful step, placing his feet in the existing mud at the trail edge where his own prints would not contaminate the area around the shoe. He photographed it from every angle before he crouched down to look at it more closely. It was a girl's sneaker, pink and white, the kind with a Velcro strap and a small decorative element on the side. A flower, printed rather than applied, faded from use. Left foot? The sole showed wear consistent with a child who walked with a slight outward turn on that foot. It was clean. Not trail dirty, not mud spattered from the storm that had come through 4 days earlier. Clean, as though it had been washed or had never been outside before this moment. It was tied. The lace, It had laces despite the Velcro strap, a design he recognized from his grandchildren's shoes, was tied in a double knot. The kind of knot a parent ties for a child who hasn't learned to tie their own shoes yet. The loops pulled tight and then crossed again so they won't come undone on a long walk. He stood up and looked at the tree line on both sides of the trail. Nothing moved. The woods were quiet, and this was the detail he returned to most often in his account. The detail he said bothered him more than the shoe itself. The woods were completely quiet. In 6 years of trail work in that system, he had never heard that forest go silent. There was always something. Birds working the understory, squirrels in the canopy, the creek running in the hollow below the trail. On that morning, at that moment, standing over that shoe, there was nothing. Not wind, not water, not a single bird. A silence so complete that he became aware of his own heartbeat, and then became aware that he was holding his breath, and let it out slowly, and heard nothing but his own exhale. He called the sheriff's department from the trail. 1 bar of service, enough for the call to go through. He described what he'd found, his location, the condition of the scene. He was told to wait at the gate. He walked back. He did not look behind him. Not out of fear, or not only out of fear, also because he understood, without being able to articulate why, that looking back at whatever was behind him was not the right thing to do on that particular morning, on that particular trail. The sheriff's department arrived. The shoe was collected as evidence. Photographs were taken of the mud around it, confirming what Gideon had documented. No prints approaching, no prints leaving. The investigating deputy said little. The trail remained closed. 2 weeks later, the shoe was confirmed as Lily Marsh's by her mother, who identified it from the photograph in the documentation report. The flower detail on the side, the wear pattern on the sole. Lily's left shoe. Lily Marsh was found 14 months later, alive, in a county 40 miles to the east. She was found near a state route in good physical condition. She had no memory of the 11 days following her disappearance. She was examined and found unharmed. She was wearing both shoes when she was found. Both of them. Left and right, the same style, the same wear pattern, the same Velcro and lace design. The right shoe confirmed as hers. The left shoe confirmed as hers. The investigating team noted this discrepancy in their report. The following line in the report changed subject. The sheriff's department offered no explanation that addressed the left shoe found on the trail. The case file was updated to reflect Lily's recovery and then closed. Gideon filed his incident report, completed his volunteer documentation, and drove home. According to the county trail coordinator who received his paperwork, he submitted everything correctly and completely, with photographs, timestamps, and detailed written notes. The documentation was thorough and professional. He never returned to volunteer on that trail system. When someone asked his wife some months later whether Gideon had said anything about why he'd stopped volunteering, she said he had. She said he'd told her the woods on that trail had gone quiet in a way he'd never heard before and didn't want to hear again. He hadn't told her about the double knot. That account came from Gideon, and it closed the way it had to, without an answer, because there isn't one. The next account has more witnesses, it has documentation. It has a man who recorded everything he found with professional equipment and professional discipline, and it has less explanation than any of the accounts before it. Warren was in his early 30s when his employer, a regional timber company, sent him to evaluate a hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky, for a potential logging lease. The company held the ridge above the hollow and was interested in whether the hollow itself might be acquired and added to the lease boundary. Warren's job was to establish the existing boundary conditions assess access, and document any structures or improvements that might complicate a purchase. Standard pre-acquisition work. He'd done it dozens of times on dozens of parcels across 3 states. He hiked into the hollow on a Wednesday morning in early November. The access from the nearest road was a 40-minute walk down a drainage. No maintained path, just the creek bed and the game trails that ran alongside it. The hollow itself was narrow, steep-sided, the kind of terrain that collected fog in the mornings and held it longer than the surrounding ridges. By the time Warren reached the bottom, the upper walls of the hollow were still in mist. He found the structure within 10 minutes of entering the hollow. It was set back from the creek on a level bench of ground, positioned where the hollow widened slightly before it narrowed again toward the head. A full building. Not a ruin, not a collapsed structure, not the remnant of something that had once been inhabitable. A complete standing structure with walls and a roof and a door, built in a style Warren couldn't immediately place. The construction technique suggesting an age and a method he didn't recognize from the regional vernacular. No tin roofing, no concrete block foundation. A combination of timber framing and stacked stone that was either very old or had been built by someone who understood old methods well enough to replicate them precisely. He circled it before he approached. That was his professional habit. Document the exterior fully before engaging with any structure on an assessment. He moved around the building at a distance of about 20 feet, noting what he saw. No windows on 3 sides. The 4th side, facing the creek, had a single small opening high in the wall, unglazed. No utility connections, no power line coming in, no evidence of a propane supply, no water line. The ground around the structure was clear of undergrowth in a radius of about 10 feet, the soil bare and packed, as though something had kept it that way for a long time. The door was on the creek-facing wall, below the small window. Blank construction, hung on iron strap hinges that were surface-mounted and hand-forged. It was closed, but not locked. No hasp, no padlock, nothing on the exterior that suggested the door was meant to be secured from the outside. Warren photographed the exterior from all 4 sides and noted the lack of any road access, any vehicle track, any evidence of how building materials had been brought into a hollow with no road. He called his supervisor from the hollow floor. No cell service. His radio couldn't reach the company office at the depth of the terrain. He hiked back up to the ridge, made his call, reported the structure's existence, and was told to document it fully and continue the assessment. He asked if the land agent had any record of a structure on the parcel. His supervisor said he'd check and call back. He never called back about the structure specifically. Warren returned to the hollow the following morning with his company camera and a voice recorder he kept in his breast pocket as a professional habit. Faster than written notes for field observations, useful for dictating measurements and descriptions when both hands were occupied. He pressed record before he descended into the hollow. The recorder ran for the entire time he was there. He went to the door. He opened it. Single room. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the door he'd opened and the small window above it. Packed earth floor, stone walls, a ceiling of rough-hewn timber low enough that Warren, who was 6 feet tall, stood with a few inches to spare. The room was empty except for a shelf on the far wall. The shelf was built into the wall itself. Timber brackets set into the stone, a plank across them at chest height. And on the shelf, arranged with the precision of a museum display, were 4 objects. A survey cap. Plastic, standard issue, with a 2-digit stamp that Warren could read from the doorway. 007. A child's shoe, left foot. Pink and white with a Velcro strap and a faded flower detail on the side. An envelope. Unsealed, face up, addressed in neat, upright handwriting to the one who finds this first. A spiral-bound notebook, open, positioned so that the visible page faced the door. Warren stood in the doorway for what he estimated was 2 minutes. He was aware of his breathing on the voice recorder. He didn't move into the room immediately, not out of fear, he said later, but because of a professional instinct that had served him well in 20 years of the field work. When you find something that doesn't fit your framework, you stop and look at it before you touch it. You give yourself time to see it correctly. The room was completely silent. Not the ordinary silence of an empty building. He'd been in plenty of empty buildings and they had their own ambient sounds. The creak of settling structure, the movement of air. This room had none of that. The silence was the kind that felt less like an absence of sound, and more like a presence of something that had displaced sound, pushed it out the way water pushes air from a submerged container. He stepped inside. He photographed each item on the shelf individually. He did not touch the envelope or the notebook yet. He photographed the room itself, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the shelf from multiple angles. Then he turned to look back at the door he'd come through, at the creek visible through it and the hollow walls beyond. He turned back to the shelf. He photographed the survey cap and set it aside. He photographed the shoe from 3 angles, noting in his voice recorder the wear pattern on the sole, the double-knotted lace, the faded flower on the side. He picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it and read it, and set it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the shelf and did not say what was on it into his voice recorder. He would describe it later in his written account, but at that moment in the hollow he said nothing. He looked at the notebook. The open page had a single entry, a date and 1 sentence. He read it and did not read it aloud. He reached for the notebook to take it. Then the door closed. He had not touched the door. He had left it open when he entered, propped open, he believed, by the angle of its hang on the strap hinges. It swung closed with a sound that was not violent, not sudden, just the sound of a door that had decided to close. The room went very dark. The small window above the door let in a bar of gray November light that was not enough to see by. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he crossed to the door and pushed it open and walked out of the structure into the hollow air. He stood facing the creek with his camera in one hand and his heart doing something it didn't normally do during field assessments. He turned around. The door was closed. He had pushed it open from inside, walked through it, and it had swung closed behind him. He could hear his voice recorder still running in his breast pocket. 47 minutes of recordings from inside the structure, he would discover later, ending with the sound of the door closing. From the outside, from the perspective of someone who had stayed in the room when Warren left. He stood outside the closed door in the narrow November light and thought about whether to open it again. He opened the door. The shelf was empty. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf for long enough that the quality of the light through the small window changed slightly, a cloud moving somewhere above the hollow's rim. The shelf was bare. The brackets were there, the plank across them was there, the wall behind it was there. The survey cap was gone. The shoe was gone. The envelope was gone. The notebook was still there. It was closed now where it had been open before. He crossed the room and picked it up. The cover was plain cardboard, the spiral binding standard issue, the kind you found in every dollar store and gas station in the country. He opened it to the page that had been visible when he first entered. He knew which page it was because of the crease in the binding, the way the book fell open at that point. The entry was still there, a date and a sentence. The date was yesterday's date. The date of his first visit to the hollow, when he had circled the structure and photographed its exterior and not entered. the day before he stood in this room for the first time. The sentence read, "They find their way back." He took the notebook. He walked out of the structure and up through the hollow and along the creek bed and up the drainage to the ridge and to his truck. He drove to the land agent's office, which was 40 miles away in the county seat, and he walked in with the notebook in his hand and told the agent what he had found. The land agent was a man in his 50s named Pruitt, someone Warren had worked with on 3 previous assessments in that county. Pruitt listened to what Warren described: the structure, the shelf, the objects, the door, the empty shelf, the notebook. When Warren finished, Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's no structure in that hollow." Warren put his camera on the desk and turned it on and showed Pruitt the photographs. The exterior of the structure from all 4 sides, the door, the interior, the shelf with the 4 objects, the survey cap, the shoe, the envelope, the open notebook. Pruitt looked at each photograph as Warren advanced through them. Then, Pruitt picked up his phone and made a call. He turned away from the desk to make it. Warren could hear his side of the conversation, which consisted of 4 sentences: a description of the situation, a response to a question, another response to a question, and then, "Understood." He hung up and turned back to Warren. He told Warren that his survey assignment for that parcel had been reassigned. He told Warren to submit all documentation, all photographs, all voice recordings, all written notes, all GPS data, to the company's legal department at the regional office. He told Warren this was not a reflection of his work and that his billing for the assessment would be honored in full. Warren asked what was in the hollow. Pruitt said the hollow wasn't part of the lease. Warren drove to the regional office and submitted his documentation. He kept copies of everything: photographs, voice recorder files, GPS logs, because he was a thorough man who maintained his own records as a professional habit. He submitted the originals and retained the copies and drove home. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the company's legal department. It contained a single page acknowledging receipt of his documentation and informing him that review was complete. The photographs submitted, and the letter stated, showed an empty hollow with no structures present. The voice recordings contained ambient field audio with no anomalous content. No further action was required. Warren looked at his copies. His copies showed the structure. His copies showed the exterior from 4 sides, the door, the interior, the shelf, the objects on the shelf, the survey cap stamped E07, the child's shoe with the double-knotted lace, the envelope, the open notebook. Every photograph he remembered taking was in his copies. Every image was there. He put his copies and the company letter side by side on his kitchen table. Same file names, same timestamps, the date, the time down to the second, the sequential numbering his camera used, different content. His copies showed a structure. The legal department's review of his submitted photographs had apparently produced images of an empty hollow. He kept the copies. He kept the notebook. He did not pursue the matter with the company. He completed his existing contracts, declined to renew his service agreement, and relocated to another state 3 months later. The account he submitted was filed anonymously, through an intermediary who vouched for the accuracy of the documentation. The name Warren is not his real name. One thing he came back to in the correspondence that accompanied his account: the date on the notebook entry. He had visited the hollow on Wednesday. He had stood outside the structure, circled it, photographed its exterior, and left without entering. He had returned Thursday morning and entered for the first time. The entry in the notebook was dated Wednesday, the date of his first visit. The date he had not gone inside. The entry had been written by whoever wrote it, whenever they wrote it, on the day Warren first appeared at the edge of the hollow, before he crossed the threshold, before he knew what was on the shelf, before he had any reason to believe the structure was anything other than an old building in a place where no building should have been. They find their way back. He understood this to refer to the objects on the shelf: the survey cap from a dead man's license, the shoe from a child found alive and wearing both shoes, the envelope addressed to whoever came first. He believed the objects had been collected from somewhere and placed there, and that when he arrived and disturbed them, touched them, photographed them, held them, they had returned to wherever they came from, or wherever they were going next. He did not know what had collected them. He did not know what the hollow was for, or who had built the structure inside it, or what the 2-digit stamp on the survey cap meant to the thing that had gathered it. He did not know what was in the envelope, and he included this omission deliberately in his account, explaining only that he had read the contents and decided not to repeat them, and that his reason for that decision was not fear of disbelief, but something closer to respect for a boundary. He felt he'd already crossed once by entering the room at all. What he did repeat at the end of his account was the sound on the voice recorder. 47 minutes of interior ambient silence, a silence he described as the most complete he had ever recorded in a built structure, as though the room itself were acoustically sealed from the surrounding hollow. And then, at the 47-minute mark, as Warren was stepping through the door and into the daylight, the sound of the door closing behind him, followed, clearly audible in the recording, by a single footstep on a packed earth floor, from inside the room that Warren had just left, from inside the empty room with the empty shelf and the closed notebook and the hollow light coming through the small window, in a structure that had no road access and no record and no existence in any database, in a hollow that the land agent said contained nothing, and the legal department confirmed was empty, 40 minutes walk from the nearest road, in the kind of terrain that holds fog longer than the ridges above it, and goes quiet in ways that are hard to explain to anyone who hasn't stood inside that silence and felt it push back. He's watching for the objects, he said at the end. He doesn't know where they'll turn up next or what form the evidence will take, but he believes the notebook's sentence was accurate, and that accuracy applies in every direction. The cap, the shoe, the envelope, they find their way back. The accounts before this one all belonged to people who were alone when it happened. That's part of what made them hard to dismiss and harder to verify. One person, one experience, one set of observations that could theoretically be explained by stress or misremembering, or the particular way that isolated places work on a person's perception over time. The next account has 2 witnesses, brothers, men who had been coming to the same piece of ground every fall for 15 years, and knew it the way you know something you've returned to enough times that its ordinary details are as familiar as your own kitchen. Darnell and Craig had hunted white-tailed deer on their family's land in Breathitt County, Kentucky, since they were old enough to carry a rifle safely. The land had been in their family for 3 generations. Their grandfather had logged the upper portion in the 50s. Their father had hunted it every season without exception, and the brothers had continued the tradition after their father's health made the terrain too demanding for him. They knew the property the way their father had known it and their grandfather before him. The hollow where the deer bedded, the ridge where they moved at first light, the creek crossing at the lower end of the property where the water ran shallow over flat limestone, and you could cross without getting your boots wet if you stepped correctly. They had crossed that creek, at that spot, on every hunting trip for 15 years. On the second morning of their trip, a Thursday in early November, cold and clear, good tracking conditions after a light frost, Craig crossed first, as he always did, because he was the older brother, and the crossing had always been his call to make. Darnell waited on the near bank, watching his brother pick his way across the limestone shelf, and was looking at the far bank when Craig stepped out of the water. Craig's boots left prints in the mud at the water's edge, as they always did, the distinctive tread of his hunting boots pressing into the soft ground at the creek's margin. Darnell was watching those prints appear, not for any particular reason, just the idle attention of a man standing still in cold morning air, waiting for his brother to clear the crossing, when he saw the second set of prints appear beside them. Not approaching from another direction, not already present in the mud, appearing, one after another, from the moment Craig's left boot cleared the water's edge and he began walking up the bank toward the tree line. A second set of tracks beside Craig's, matching his pace, matching his stride length, moving with him step for step toward the woods. Darnell stood on the near bank and did not say anything. He looked at Craig, who was walking normally, looking ahead at the tree line, rifle slung, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who knew where he was going. Craig did not look down. Craig did not pause. He walked up the bank and into the edge of the tree line and stopped at a cedar he used as a landmark before angling toward the blind, and the second set of prints stopped when he stopped and started when he started and followed him into the shadow of the trees. Darnell crossed. He stepped onto the far bank and looked at the mud. The prints were barefoot. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, not any impression he recognized from 15 years on that piece of ground. Human-shaped, toes, ball, arch, heel, but narrower than any adult foot he'd seen, and the depth of the impression inconsistent. Some prints barely touching the surface, and others pressed in fully, as though the weight behind them varied in ways that a normal walking stride did not account for. He called to Craig, who came back from the tree line. Craig looked at the prints. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, crouching over them, following them with his eyes from the water's edge to the point where they disappeared into the harder ground under the cedar. "Those weren't there when I crossed," Craig said. Darnell said he knew. They followed the prints for 20 yards into the tree line, where the ground hardened and the impressions became too faint to follow reliably. The prints stopped, not at a tree, not at a rock face, not at any physical boundary that would explain why they stopped. They stopped in the middle of open ground between two oaks, in a small area of bare soil where nothing should have interrupted a walking stride, as though whatever had been making them had simply stepped upward out of the world. Darnell stood at the place where the prints ended and looked up. The canopy was bare enough in November to see a good distance into it. Nothing was there. Then he noticed the creek. He noticed it because he couldn't hear it. The creek was 20 yards behind them. It was a functioning creek in November, running from a reliable spring on the upper property, audible from anywhere on the lower land under normal conditions. In 15 years on this property, in every season, in wet years and dry years and years, when the spring ran so low you could step across it in 3 inches of water, the creek had always been audible from the lower ground. It was part of the soundscape of the place in the way that permanent things became part of a place. You noticed it the way you noticed your own breathing, which is to say you mostly didn't notice it until it stopped. It had stopped. Darnell turned toward where the sound should have been coming from. He could see the water through the trees, the pale limestone of the crossing, the dark surface moving over it, the ripple at the downstream edge where the current quickened. The water was moving. He could see it moving, he could not hear it. The silence where the creek sound should have been was absolute, and it was not the silence of distance or wind direction or any of the ordinary reasons a sound might fail to carry. It was the silence of a sound that had been present and was now gone, and the difference between those two silences was something that both brothers felt in the same moment, and neither had to explain to the other. They walked back to camp. They did not discuss what they had seen or heard. They broke camp with the efficiency of people who had camped together for years and knew how to divide the work without talking about it. And they loaded the truck and drove off the property and onto the county road before either of them said anything at all. They did not return to hunt that afternoon. They drove home. That evening, Craig cleaned his gear at the kitchen sink, which was his habit after a trip. Boots first, then rifle, then pack. He pulled his left boot off and turned it over to scrape the mud from the tread, and stopped. On the sole of his left boot, the boot he had used to cross the creek that morning. The boot whose print Darnell had watched appear in the mud of the far bank. There was a print pressed into the rubber of the sole itself. A barefoot toe print. Not mud transferred from the ground. A print pressed into the material, the way a print pressed into soft wax or clay, capturing the shape of a toe and part of the ball of a foot in the rubber surface, as though the rubber had been soft enough at some point to receive it. The creek had not been soft ground. The limestone shelf was hard. Craig's boots had crossed it dozens of times without any impression left in the soles. Craig held the boot under the dome light above the sink and looked at the print for a long time. Then he set the boot down and finished cleaning the rest of his gear and did not say anything about it to Darnell that night or afterward. Darnell submitted the account. He said Craig does not know he did. The family land in Breathitt County has not been hunted since that November. When people ask why, Darnell says the property needs work before it's worth the trip. Craig says the same thing. They have not discussed coordinating that answer. They didn't need to. The accounts up to this point all involved discoveries made in places the person had chosen to enter. A ridge, a trail, a tower, a road, a hollow, a creek bottom. Beverly didn't choose to enter anywhere. She was doing the thing you do after someone dies, which is the hard practical work of clearing what they left behind. And what she found was already there, already waiting, already arranged inside the walls of a house her father had kept for 30 years. Beverly was 44 when her father died in late February. He had lived alone for most of his adult life, divorced when Beverly was 11, solitary by temperament, the kind of man who was fond of his family but more comfortable at a distance from them. He'd kept the cabin in Mingo County, West Virginia, since before Beverly was born. A small place on a private road off a state route. 2 rooms and a porch and a wood stove that he'd replaced once in 30 years. He went up there on weekends when the weather suited him, and sometimes for longer stretches in the summer. Beverly had been there perhaps a dozen times in her life, always as a child, always briefly. She remembered it as a place that felt complete in itself, sufficient to whoever was inside it, which was her father's quality more than the cabin's. She drove up in mid-March, 2 weeks after the funeral, on a clear, cold day with the last of the snow still on the north-facing slopes. She brought cleaning supplies, garbage bags, a folding box for anything worth keeping, and the practical resignation of someone who has accepted that grief and logistics occupy the same calendar. The cabin was cold and smelled of wood smoke, and the specific staleness of a place that hadn't been opened in months. She turned the baseboard heat on, left the front door open while the air cleared, and began in the kitchen because kitchens were practical, and she needed to start somewhere practical. She worked through the morning. Cabinets cleared, shelves wiped, the ancient refrigerator emptied and unplugged. She moved to the main room in the early afternoon and worked through the furniture methodically. Her father had been a man of few possessions and fewer decorations, so the surfaces were spare and the decisions were mostly easy. A lamp she remembered from childhood, a chair that had belonged to his own father, a stack of paperback westerns with broken spines that she boxed for the library donation bin. On the wall beside the front window, her father had kept a clock. She had always assumed it was decorative, a round wooden clock, the kind with a hinged front panel that she had no memory of ever seeing him open or wind. It had always read 4:20, the hands fixed, the clock long stopped, and she had assumed as a child that it was kept for sentimental reasons rather than practical ones. She lifted it off its nail and turned it over, planning to add it to the box, and the front panel swung open. Behind the face of the clock, in the space where the movement should have been, the mechanism had been removed at some point, the housing emptied, there was a photograph. A single photograph folded once to fit the space. She unfolded it. It showed the cabin's back porch. The perspective was from outside, from the direction of the tree line, as though the photographer had stood in the woods and angled their lens toward the structure. Her father was in the photograph, younger. She placed him at 40 or so, which put the image 30 years back, sitting in the wooden chair he kept on the porch, a coffee mug on the railing beside him, looking out at the yard in the way he looked at things when he was thinking, and not particularly aware of being observed. The photograph was candid. Her father did not know he was being photographed. Standing in the open doorway behind him, partially in shadow, was a figure. Tall. The proportions were right for a person. Head, shoulders, the vertical line of a body standing upright. But the image was shot on film, and the doorway was darker than the porch, and the figure was far enough back in the interior that the details didn't resolve into anything she could identify with certainty. Gender, age, clothing, none of it was clear. What was clear was the orientation. The figure was not looking at the camera. It was looking at her father. At the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, at the coffee mug on the railing. Watching him the way you watch something you have been watching for a long time. Beverly set the photograph on the kitchen table and went back to the main room and began looking at the other walls, the other surfaces, the other places a person might keep something they didn't want found casually. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She looked anyway. She found the shoebox under the floorboards of the back bedroom. The floorboards in that room had always been loose. She had a memory of them shifting underfoot when she was a child, the particular sound of old wood on old wood, and one section near the far wall lifted when she pressed it at the right angle, the way her father must have pressed it every time, revealing a shallow space between the floor and the ground below. The shoebox was the only thing in it. Inside the shoebox were 11 more photographs, all exterior, all shot from the same position in the tree line, the same perspective, the same angle toward the cabin's back porch and back wall. They spanned, based on the apparent ages of the people in them and the condition of the structure, somewhere between 30 and 40 years. Early images showed the cabin newer, the porch boards unweathered. Later, images showed it as she knew it. The boards gray, the railing repaired with mismatched lumber, the woodpile in its familiar position against the south wall. In every photograph, someone was on or near the porch. Sometimes her father, sometimes a visitor she recognized, an uncle, a neighbor. One image she thought might be her own mother taken during a visit Beverly didn't remember. In every photograph, standing in the doorway or visible through the back window, the same figure, same height, same orientation, always looking at whoever was on the porch, never at the camera, never moving toward the porch or away from it. Simply there, in the interior, watching. The final photograph in the box was the most recent. The structure matched its current condition precisely. The railing repair, the newer woodpile. She recognized the season from the light and the state of the tree line. Late summer, she estimated. 6 weeks before her father died. Beverly was in it. She was sitting in the porch chair. The coffee mug was on the railing where her father's mug had been in the first photograph. But the mug was hers. She recognized the design. A mug from a regional coffee roaster that she bought for herself and brought when she visited. She was looking out at the yard. She did not know she was being photographed. She visited the cabin 6 weeks before her father died. She had driven up on a Saturday, spent the afternoon with him, driven back that evening. It had been an ordinary visit. She remembered it without particular detail. They had sat on the porch, talked about ordinary things. She had stayed for dinner and left before dark. She could not remember anything unusual about that afternoon. She also could not remember looking at the photograph when her father had gone inside. She had thought he was with her on the porch the entire afternoon. She remembered his voice from the direction of the chair beside her. She remembered talking to him without looking at him particularly, the way you talk to someone you're comfortable with, watching the yard instead of the person. She could not reconstruct a moment when he had stood up and gone inside. She could not reconstruct a moment when she had been alone on the porch. In the photograph, she was alone on the porch. The figure in the doorway was watching her. On the back of the photograph, in her father's handwriting, careful, slightly shaky in the way his writing had become in the last years, 4 words: "Don't go back after dark." She had gone back after dark on that visit. She had driven to the nearest town for something her father needed from the hardware store. A specific size of fuse for the breaker box, she thought, though she was no longer certain, and had returned after sunset, when the property was dark except for the porch light. She could not remember what had happened after she returned. She remembered arriving. She remembered the porch light. And then she remembered sitting at the dinner table with her father, and the food already prepared. The interval between the two memories was gone. She sold the cabin 3 weeks after she found the photographs. She did not tell the buyer what she had found. She did not tell anyone what she had found for a long time, except eventually a family friend who worked in digital image restoration, to whom she sent the shoebox photographs with a request to enhance the figure in the doorway. He called her the day after she sent them. He asked if she was certain she wanted him to send the enhanced version. She said yes, he sent it. She has not described what she saw in the enhanced image. She has said only that she understood, after seeing it, why her father had hidden the photographs in the floor instead of destroying them. She had thought, when she found them, that keeping them was the strange choice. After seeing the enhancement, she understood that keeping them was the only choice that made any sense. Destroying them would have meant acknowledging directly to whatever was in them that you knew it was there. She keeps the shoebox in her car. Not in her house, not in a closet or a drawer or a cabinet. In the trunk of her car, in a section of it she otherwise doesn't use, where it has been for more than a year. She left the clock on the wall when she sold the cabin. She left it exactly as she found it, hanging on its nail, the front panel closed, reading 4:20 the way it always had. She told herself the new owners would think it was decorative. She told herself they would have no reason to open it. She hopes she's right about that. This account was submitted without a name. The person who sent it included a single line of explanation before the account itself. He didn't want whatever it was to know he had told anyone. That's the exact phrasing he used. Not that he was afraid of being identified, not that he was protecting his privacy. He didn't want it to know. We were calling him the driver, which is what he called himself in the submission, and we're leaving everything else exactly as he wrote it. He was driving home from a job site on a November night, a route he'd taken dozens of times, a state route through Pike County, Kentucky, that connected the county where he worked to the county where he lived. 2 lanes, no shoulder worth mentioning, the kind of road that had enough curves to keep you focused and enough straightaways to let your mind settle into the rhythm of the drive. He knew it well enough to know where the bad curves were, where the frost heaves had buckled the pavement, where you needed to slow for the bridge at the creek crossing 3 miles in. He had left the job site late. It was past 10 when he turned onto the state route, which meant no other traffic. That stretch of road saw almost nothing after 9 on a weeknight. The nearest town in either direction small enough that the late hours were genuinely empty. He had his headlights on and his radio on low, and his windows up against the November cold. He was tired in the specific way of a man who has done physical work for 10 hours and has an hour's drive between him and his bed. He saw the first closure sign a mile in. Standard KYTC signage, orange diamond, black border, the flagger symbol, road closed ahead in the reflective lettering that caught headlights from a distance. He knew the route well enough to know that no closure had been scheduled for this stretch, and he'd driven it 2 days before without any signage present. But closures happened without much notice on rural routes, and the detour boards that should have been posted at the county road junction sometimes weren't. He slowed, looked for a detour indicator, didn't see one, and made the decision that tired people on familiar roads make. He continued. The road looked clear. The closure was probably a nighttime crew working further ahead, something he could navigate around or that had already cleared. He drove another mile, the same sign. He took his foot off the accelerator. The sign was on the right shoulder, same position relative to the road edge, same height on its post, same condition. And he was close enough this time to see the detail of it as his headlights swept across. The black sticker on the back post support, partially visible from the front, "Do not pass." A small rectangular sticker, the kind a crew chief put on signage to indicate it had been inspected. He had noticed it on the first sign because it was slightly crooked, adhered at an angle that caught his eye. The sticker on this sign was crooked at the same angle. He stopped the truck. He sat in the middle of the empty road with his headlights running out ahead of him and his hazards off, and thought about what he was looking at. He had driven in one direction for 2 miles without a turn, without a curve significant enough to loop back, on a road he knew well enough to navigate in the dark without thinking about it. There was one sign. He had passed it. It was ahead of him again. He drove on. The third sign was 2 miles after the second. Same sign, same post, same sticker at the same angle. He drove past it without stopping and watched his odometer. 1 mile. The fourth sign appeared at exactly 1 mile. The same sign, the same everything, sitting on the shoulder of a road that had been running straight and true, and had given him no opportunity to circle back. He put both hands on the wheel and kept his speed steady and did not stop. Then his headlights found something on the right shoulder of the road. A figure. Standing at the road's edge, facing away from him, facing into the tree line, shoulders squared, completely still. The figure was dressed in dark clothing and stood with the posture of someone who had been standing in that position for a long time and had no intention of changing it. His headlights caught the figure for the 2 or 3 seconds it took him to pass at his current speed, and in that time he registered adult height, dark clothing, bare hands, the stillness of it, the way it did not react to his headlights or the sound of his engine. He did not slow down. He kept his speed and kept his hands on the wheel and watched his rearview mirror. The figure receded in the red wash of his taillights, still facing the tree line, still not moving. 1 mile later, the figure was on the right shoulder, same posture, same stillness, same orientation toward the tree line, shoulders squared, hands at its sides. He was 1 mile past where he'd seen it, and it was ahead of him. He kept driving. He did not look at it directly as he passed. He looked at the center line of the road and kept his peripheral vision on the right shoulder and drove past it at a steady speed and did not slow down. A quarter-mile ahead, his headlights found it again. It was closer to the road edge this time. Not on the shoulder, but at the white line, the toes of its shoes at the painted boundary. Same posture, same orientation. Not looking at the road, not looking at him. Looking at the tree line the way something looks at a place it knows well and is waiting for a reason to enter. He remembered then, and the remembering came with the quality of something surfacing from deep water rather than something he had simply forgotten. A conversation at a gas station in an adjacent county 2 weeks earlier. He'd stopped for fuel on a different route, a different day, nothing significant about the stop. The attendant was a man he'd never seen before and never saw again, and while his card was processing, the man had said, without being asked and without any particular lead-in, "Don't stop on this stretch after dark, especially if the road looks like it's closed. Keep moving, keep your lights on, don't look at what's on the shoulder." He had no explanation for how an attendant at a gas station in another county had known to say that about this specific road. He had never been able to construct one. He kept his lights on, he kept moving. He fixed his eyes on the center line and kept his hands on the wheel at the positions his father had taught him, and breathed steadily through his nose, and did not look at the right shoulder again. He watched his odometer instead. He watched the numbers turn. Tenths of miles, then full miles. The numbers climbing with the slow reliability of a mechanical thing doing what it was built to do. He drove for what felt like a very long time. His radio, which he was certain he had turned off before the first sign, he could remember reaching for the dial and turning it. The specific small resistance of the knob under his fingers came on. Not a station he recognized, not a frequency he knew. Something between stations, the kind of sound that lives in the gaps of the dial. But underneath the static there was something that might have been music, and might have been a voice, and might have been neither. He did not reach for the dial, he let it play. He kept his eyes on the center line. He drove 11 more miles before his odometer told him he had cleared the stretch of road. He knew the road well enough to know where it ended. A junction with a county road, a stop sign, the particular configuration of the reflectors on the signpost. When he reached it, he stopped and sat at the junction for a moment before he turned. He turned off the radio. The dial, when he looked at it, was set to a frequency that the county's broadcast map did not include. A number that sat in a band allocated to a different purpose. Not music, not talk, not any format he'd heard in that region. He drove home. He did not turn the radio back on. The following week, he pulled his truck's maintenance log, which included odometer readings from his regular service appointments, and calculated the distance he'd driven that night against the measured length of the route on a county road map. The route was 7.1 miles. His odometer showed he had driven 23.4 miles of it. He had a dash cam. He watched the footage. The footage showed 7.1 miles of empty road. 2 lanes, night, his headlights running ahead of him. No closure signs, no figure on the shoulder, no stops. 7.1 miles of driving, and then the junction, and then his county road, and then his driveway. The timestamp ran continuously, unbroken, covering the duration of a 7.1 mile drive. His odometer said 23.4 miles. He doesn't drive at night anymore. He doesn't care how far it adds. He submitted this account because, he said, he didn't think keeping it to himself was making it any better. He didn't think telling it would either. He just thought it should be written down somewhere by someone, the way things that happen should be recorded even when they can't be explained, even when the recording changes nothing about what occurred on that road on that November night, on 16 miles of road that a dash cam insists don't exist. This account is different from the others because it has 2 people, and both of them submitted separate accounts afterward. The details match in every respect except one. And that one discrepancy is the part that neither of them has been able to stop thinking about. We're calling them Sandra and Ray, and the cabin they rented was in Owsley County, Kentucky, in the first week of December. Sandra had found the listing on a regional rental site, one of the smaller platforms that aggregated rural properties, not the large national services. The listing showed a small cabin on a private road, 1 bedroom, wood stove, covered porch, available for the weekend at an off-season rate that was low enough to make a spontaneous trip practical. She and Ray had been talking about getting away from the city for months, the vague kind of talking that doesn't become action until someone makes the decision and books the thing. She made the decision on a Wednesday night and drove up with Ray on a Friday afternoon. The cabin road was a single-lane dirt track, 1.5 miles off the state route, with enough switchback to it that they couldn't see the cabin until the final turn. When they came around that last curve and the cabin appeared in their headlights, Sandra's first reaction was relief. It was as advertised, a small, clean-looking structure with a covered porch and a wood stove chimney, and a shed to the right that presumably housed the generator. Then she noticed the porch light was on. Ray noticed it at the same moment. They sat in the car for a second without saying anything, both of them registering the same thing. The property had been described as empty for 3 weeks. No previous guests. Off-season, the management company's standard protocol for unoccupied rentals was to leave everything off. The porch light was on. There was light visible through the front window as well. The warm orange of an interior light, the kind that meant something inside was running. They went in. The cabin was warm. The baseboard heat was running at what felt like a set temperature, not the cold of a space that had been unoccupied, the warmth of a space that had been maintained, that someone had kept at a livable temperature. In the kitchen, on the gas range, a pot of water sat on a lit burner. The water had a rolling simmer just below boiling, a fine mist rising from it in the warm air. Ray called the management company while Sandra stood in the kitchen looking at the pot. The number went to a recording after business hours. He left a message describing what they'd found: the heat running, the lights on, the water on the stove, and asked for a callback. He sent a text to the same number. They turned off the burner. They looked through the cabin, main room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and found nothing unusual. No signs of recent occupation, no personal belongings, no food in the cabinets, no damp towels in the bathroom, no indication that anyone had been there. The cabin was as described in the listing: basic, clean, impersonal in the way rental properties were impersonal. Then Sandra walked to the end of the back hallway. The hallway was short, 4 feet, maybe 5, connecting the bedroom to the bathroom. On the left wall, a coat hook with a single wire hanger on it. On the right wall, a thermometer in a plastic frame. And at the end, a door. Not the bathroom door, that was on the right, halfway down the hall. This door was at the hallway's end, and it was held shut by a hook and eye latch mounted on the outside of the frame. The hook was seated in the eye. The door was latched from the outside. She unhooked it and pushed the door open. The room was small. A single wooden chair in the center, positioned with a deliberateness that reminded her of nothing so much as a room that had been arranged for a specific purpose and then left to wait. The chair faced the window, and the window faced the tree line. Bare November hardwoods 12 feet from the glass, close enough that the upper branches were visible above the frame. No light in the room, no outlet, no fixture. Just the chair and the window and the tree line beyond. She photographed it on her phone before she stepped inside. Then she stepped inside and looked at the chair from 3 feet away, at the window, at the tree line. Nothing outside moved. The woods were ordinary woods in the last light of a December afternoon. dark, coming fast the way it came fast in winter, the color bleeding out of everything by 4 o'clock. Ray found the guest book in the main room, on the shelf beside the wood stove where such things were usually kept. He paged through it, 3 years of entries, regular guests, seasonal visitors, a couple who came every autumn without fail. Ordinary entries, the routine testimonials of people who had stayed somewhere pleasant and wanted to record that they'd been there. Near the back of the book, behind the most recent entries, he found a note tucked into the binding. A folded piece of paper, not part of the guest book itself, inserted between the back cover and the last page. He unfolded it and read it, and brought it to Sandra in the back room. The note said, "Do not latch the back room door. Do not lock it. Do not move the chair. If you hear it during the night, do not answer." No signature, no indication of when it had been placed there. The handwriting was the same careful, upright hand that had appeared in the guest book entry Marcus had found. The same block letters, the same even pressure, the same way of forming the word "do not" as though the instruction were the most important part and the rest of the sentence was secondary. Ray wanted to leave. It was a reasonable position, Sandra said later. The warm cabin, the water on the stove, the back room, and the note were collectively enough to justify packing the bags and driving the hour and a half to the nearest motel. She understood his instinct. Her own instinct was different, and she tried to explain it in her account. It was cold, it was late. The road out was a 1-lane dirt track with the ice forecast overnight, and she had already paid for 2 nights. She told herself the note was from a previous guest who had spooked themselves, the way people spooked themselves in isolated places, and that the warm cabin was a thermostat malfunction, and the water on the stove was something the listing's previous guests had left and the management company had failed to notice. She almost believed it. She believed enough of it to propose a compromise. They would move their sleeping bags to the main room, relatch the back room door, and leave at first light if either of them wanted to. Ray agreed. They made the main room as comfortable as they could. Sleeping bags on the floor by the wood stove. Both interior lights on, the front door locked with the deadbolt and the chain, and settled in. Sandra had her phone propped against the wood stove with the audio recorder running, the voice memo app open, recording the room. She told herself it was a practical decision. If anything happened during the night, she'd have a record of it. She did not tell Ray she had started the recording. At 2:40 in the morning, the latch on the back room door unhooked itself. They were both awake. She knew they were both awake because Ray's breathing had changed hours earlier into the particular shallow rhythm of someone lying still and pretending to sleep, and she recognized it because hers was the same. The sound of the latch was small and clear in the quiet cabin, a single metallic tick, the sound of a hook lifting from an eye. They lay without moving. The door swung open. The back room beyond was dark. The hallway light was on, and it reached maybe 2 feet past the threshold, illuminating the floor just inside the room, the bare boards, and the edge of something. The chair, visible in the hallway light, facing the hallway door, not the window. The chair that Sandra had left facing the window when she photographed the room that afternoon. The chair that had moved while the door was latched. They did not speak. They did not move. Sandra lay with her eyes on the rectangle of the open doorway, and Ray lay with his car keys in his right hand, which she saw when she turned her head slightly to look at him. He had taken his car keys from his jacket pocket at some point during the night without saying anything, and he was holding them in his closed fist against his chest. Then, from the back room, a footstep. One step on the wooden floor, slow and deliberate, the sound of weight placed carefully rather than weight placed normally. the specific sound of a person who is trying not to be heard, and is therefore, paradoxically, more audible than they would have been moving naturally. Then, silence. Sandra's phone was still recording. Ray's account of what happened next differs from Sandra's in one specific respect. Sandra's account says they looked at each other, made a shared decision without speaking, and began to move toward the front door. Ray's account says this is correct. Both accounts agree on the movement, the timing, the sequence of events that followed. The discrepancy is in what preceded it. Sandra says they moved immediately after the footstep, when the silence after it had lasted long enough to confirm it wasn't going to repeat. Ray says this is not quite right. Ray says there was something else before they moved. A voice from the back room, low, unclear, the words not fully formed, but carrying the shape of a name, his name. He says he heard it once, clearly enough to be certain it was his name, and that this was what made them move. Sandra says she heard nothing before they moved. Only the footstep, and then the silence, and then they went. Her phone recorded 51 minutes of audio before they left. Her brother, who works in audio production, reviewed the recording a week later. He told her the recording was mostly ambient, the wood stove, the baseboard heat, the small sounds of the cabin at night. Then, at the 51-minute mark, one anomaly, a voice. Low, degraded, the quality of it like a recording of a recording. Something stored and replayed rather than freshly spoken. Her brother said it sounded like audio that had been compressed over a long period. The frequencies narrowed, the edges of it gone soft with whatever had held it for however long it had been held. The voice said a name. Once. Not Ray's name. Sandra researched the name afterward, when she was home and the recording was on her laptop, and she had listened to it enough times to be certain of what she was hearing. The name, searched against public records and local newspaper archives for Owsley County, returned a single consistent result. A man who had rented a cabin in that county in the autumn of 2011 and had reported a disturbance to the county sheriff's office. The sheriff's report from that year described an incident at a rental property, location matching, details matching, and was filed and processed and marked in the record system as a duplicate. The original report it supposedly duplicated did not appear in the county records. No original. Just the notation that this was a duplicate of something that could not be found. The man whose name was on the recording died in 2014. The cause was listed as natural, and the details were not public record. Sandra found his name in an obituary that mentioned his love of the outdoors and his familiarity with eastern Kentucky's hill country, and nothing else that was relevant. The voice in the back room had been calling for a man who had stood in that same cabin 13 years earlier, reporting the same disturbance to the same county, whose original report had been erased from the record. Had been calling his name in the dark, in the voice of something that had been storing that name for 13 years, waiting for someone to be in the cabin at night with the door unlatched so it could use it. She and Ray were in the car by 3:10, backing down the one-lane road in the dark, the headlights showing the cabin's front face receding behind them. Sandra was watching the cabin through the rear window, which meant she was watching the back room's window, the window that faced the tree line, 12 feet of dead grass and then the woods. The window was lit. Not the porch light, not the interior lights they'd left running in the main room. The back room window specifically. The room with no light source, no fixture, no outlet. That window was producing light. A steady, even illumination from inside a room that had nothing in it that could produce light. It stayed lit as they backed down the road. It was still lit when they reached the first switchback, and the cabin disappeared behind the curve of the hill. They did not speak until they reached the state route. Sandra pulled out of the cabin road onto the pavement, and stopped at the junction and sat with the engine running and the heater running, and both of them looking at the road ahead, and neither of them said anything for long enough that the defroster cleared the lower half of the windshield completely. Then Ray said he wanted to find somewhere with lights. She said yes. They drove toward the nearest town. The nearest town was 31 miles away. It had a gas station that was open all night, and a diner that opened at 5 and nothing else with lights on at 4 in the morning. They parked at the gas station and sat in the car in the fluorescent overhang light, and Sandra found the audio recorder still running on her phone and stopped it. 51 minutes of recording. She didn't play it back right then. She turned the heat up and they sat there until the diner opened, and then they went inside and ordered coffee, and did not talk about the cabin in any specific way. They talked around it. Ray mentioned the drive back. Sandra mentioned calling the management company in the morning, but they did not discuss the footstep or the voice or the lit window, because there was nothing to say about those things at 4 in the morning in a diner 31 miles from where they'd been that would have made any difference. The management company called back at 9:40 the next morning, after they were already home. Sandra had sent a detailed text at 7 describing what they'd experienced: the warm cabin, the water on the stove, the back room, the note, the latch unhooking, the footstep, the voice, the window. The person who called said they were sorry for any discomfort the stay had caused and that the property would be reviewed. When Sandra asked specifically about the back room, the person said the cabin had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a main living area with a kitchen. No back room. Sandra said she had photographs of it. The person said they would look into it and call back. They did not call back. The management company's listing, when Sandra checked it that afternoon, had been changed. The photographs were different, new images, taken in a different season, showing the cabin from angles that didn't include the back hallway. The listing described the property as a 1-bedroom cabin. She scrolled through every image twice. The back room was not visible in any of them. She sent her photographs to Ray. He confirmed they matched what she remembered: the hallway, the latch on the outside of the door, the chair facing the window, the room with no light fixture. She saved everything to a second location and to a backup drive and to an email to herself with the subject line that she did not share in her account, but described as something she could read in her sent folder anytime she needed, to confirm she was not inventing the memory. 3 days after they returned, Sandra's brother listened to the recording. He called her while he was still at his workstation, which meant she could hear the audio interface in the background, the hum of his equipment. He told her the recording was clear for the first 51 minutes, the wood stove, the baseboard heat, the small movements of a settling cabin, and that the anomaly at the end was unmistakable. He asked if she knew the name. She said no. He played it for her through the phone, the section of recording around the anomaly, the ambient silence, and then the voice, and then the ambient silence again. She heard the name. She sat with it for a moment. Then she started looking. The name led her to the 2011 sheriff's report through a search of digitized local newspaper archives, a brief item noting that a complaint had been filed regarding a disturbance at a rental property in Owsley County. The complainant named, the matter described as under review. The newspaper item ended there. When she pulled the sheriff's department record through the county's public records portal, the 2011 filing appeared in the index and produced a document when accessed, but the document was marked duplicate. See original filing, and the link to the original filing returned an error page. She called the sheriff's department and asked about the original filing. The clerk she reached searched the system twice and told her there was no original filing under that reference number. The duplicate notation in the 2011 document was, as far as the system was concerned, pointing to something that did not exist. She found the man's obituary through a genealogy site that had indexed local obituaries going back 40 years. He had died in March of 2014 at 53. The obituary mentioned his family, his work history, his love of the Kentucky Hill Country. There was no mention of the 2011 incident. There was no reason there would have been. She and Ray drove back to Owsley County on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the stay. Not to the cabin. They drove to the county seat and found a local history archive at the public library and asked the librarian if she knew anything about rental properties on the road where the cabin was located. The librarian was a woman in her 60s, someone who had clearly lived her entire life in that county and knew its geography the way Patsy had known her mail route. She looked at the road name Sandra gave her, and then looked at Sandra in the careful, measuring way of someone deciding how much to say. She said that road had had 1 or 2 properties on it for a long time. She said the county had looked at one of the parcels at some point. She didn't recall the specifics, and that the consensus among people who knew that area was that the properties there were better left to people who understood what they were getting into. Sandra asked what that meant. The librarian said she couldn't speak to specifics. She said she'd grown up hearing that some land held things that the land had been holding long before anyone built on it, and that building on it didn't change what was being held. It just gave it a door to stand behind. She said this without drama, in the tone of a person stating a practical fact about a place they knew well. Then she asked if there was anything else she could help them find. Ray drove home. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and his eyes on the road in the way of a man who is keeping himself from thinking about something by focusing on the immediate mechanics of what he is doing. Sandra watched the road too. Neither of them turned the radio on the entire drive. The recording was on Sandra's phone and her laptop and her backup drive and in the email to herself. She had not deleted any copy. She played it sometimes, the relevant section, the ambient silence and then the voice, and then the silence again. Not because she wanted to hear it, but because she needed to confirm it was still there, that the voice was still on the recording, that the recording had not changed the way the photographs in Warren's account had changed, the way the sheriff's report had changed, the way the management company listing had changed. It was still there each time she checked. The voice, the name, the specific quality of it that her brother had described as a recording of a recording. Something stored, he said, for a long time. She thought about what the librarian had said. Some land held things long before anyone built on it. She thought about the man whose name was on the recording. About the cabin in 2011 and whatever had happened there that he'd felt the need to report to the sheriff's office, and the report that had been filed and marked a duplicate of something that no longer existed, and the 3 years between that report and his death in 2014, and what those 3 years might have been like for him, and whether the voice in the recording had called his name in a cabin 13 years ago, the way it had called it into her phone on a December night in Owsley County. She thought about the note in the guest book binding. If you hear it during the night, do not answer. Ray had not answered. She had not answered. They had moved instead, quietly and quickly toward the door, and whatever the voice had been looking for, it had not found it in them. She believed this was the correct interpretation of what had happened. She was not entirely certain. The cabin listing was reviewed following their submission. The listing was removed from the platform entirely within a week of their account being filed. The platform's customer support, reached by a third party, confirmed that the property owner had requested the listing be taken down and provided no other information. The back room is still in the cabin. Sandra knows this because the cabin is still standing. She found the property in county records and confirmed the structure had not been demolished. Whatever is behind that door, whatever unlatches it from the inside in the small hours and moves the chair to face the hallway, is still there. The door still has a hook and eye latch on the outside. Whether the current owners know to use it, she doesn't know. Ray checks the back of every room now. Hotels, rentals, his own apartment, any space he's going to sleep in, he checks every door before he settles. He doesn't explain why to anyone who notices. He just checks. It's the first thing he does when he arrives somewhere new. He checks before he puts down account 12 as the last one with 2 people. Account 13 has 1, and it's the quietest account in the collection. It's also the only one where nothing moved, nothing followed, nothing called anyone's name. What was found was simply there, waiting, the way things in those mountains sometimes wait. Dora was 67 years old, a retired school teacher, and she had been walking the same trail in Carter County, Kentucky, every summer for 30 years. Not a difficult trail, a maintained path through second-growth hardwoods that climbed a low ridge and came back down by a different route. 3 miles total, a loop she could complete in under 2 hours at a comfortable pace. She knew every section of it. She knew where the trail crossed a seep that ran muddy after rain, where the ridge offered a long view east, where the tulip poplars grew tall enough to turn the light green in July. She had walked it in her 30s and her 40s and her 50s and into her 60s, and the trail had been, for 30 years, one of the fixed things in her life, a place that was reliably itself, that remained constant while other things changed. She parked at the trailhead on a Sunday morning in July, signed the register the way she always did, and started up the path at 8 o'clock. The morning was clear and already warm, the kind of July morning in eastern Kentucky that promised heat by midday, but was still pleasant in the early hours under the canopy. She carried a water bottle and a folded paper map she'd never needed to open, and she wore the same pair of boots she'd been walking in for 6 years, re-soled once and still sound. She was 40 minutes in, approaching the bend in the trail where the ridge turned and the view opened up to the east, when she saw the stone. It was off the trail's right edge, set back maybe 3 feet in the leaf litter between 2 oaks. She noticed it because she had passed this point hundreds of times, and the stone had not been there. She knew this section of trail the way she knew the layout of her own kitchen. Not because she had cataloged it consciously, but because 30 years of repeated attention had built a detailed map of it in her mind that registered anomalies automatically. The stone was an anomaly. It had not been there the last time she walked this trail, 3 weeks earlier. She stepped off the path and crouched beside it. It was roughly the size of a large dictionary, irregular in shape, the dark limestone common to that part of Carter County, half buried in the leaf litter with its upper face exposed and worked. Carved. Someone had cut into the surface with a narrow tool, the cuts clean and precise, the kind of work that took skill and patience and the right equipment. She brushed away the leaf debris that had accumulated in the cuts and looked at what was there. A list of names. 13 of them, arranged in a column, cut into the stone with consistent depth and spacing. The lettering was careful, not ornate, not stylized, just clear and functional, the way an inscription is made when the maker wants it to be readable rather than decorative. She read the names from top to bottom. 12 of them she did not recognize. Not local names she associated with Carter County families. Not names she connected to anyone she knew or had known in 30 years of walking that trail. Just names, 13 of them, cut into a stone that had not been there 3 weeks ago. The 13th name was hers. She did not move for a moment. She stayed crouched beside the stone and looked at her name in the limestone, and felt the particular quality of the silence around her, which was the ordinary silence of a summer morning in the woods. Insects, birds, the distant sound of the seep running somewhere below the ridge, and not the wrong silence that other people in these accounts had described. The silence was normal. The woods were normal. The July morning was normal in every respect, except that her name was carved into a stone between two oak trees on a trail she had walked for 30 years. She stood up. She looked at the stone for another moment. Then she stepped back onto the trail and continued her walk. She completed the loop. The remaining hour and 20 minutes of the trail were ordinary. The ridge view, the descent through the tulip poplars, the last flat section back to the trailhead. She signed out of the register at the kiosk, noted her exit time the way she always did, and drove home. She did not call anyone. She did not stop anywhere on the drive. She sat with it for 3 weeks. She is, by her own description, a practical woman, a retired school teacher, which is a profession that produces people who are good at managing their own responses, at separating the significant from the distracting, at deciding what requires action and what requires patience. She sat with what she'd found for 3 weeks, and during that time she asked herself the questions that a practical person asks. Could she have misread the name? No, it was her name, her full name, which was not a common name, cut clearly enough to be unambiguous. Could the stone have been there on previous walks, and she had simply missed it? She did not believe so, and her 30 years of attention to that trail was the basis of that belief. Could someone have placed it as a prank or an oddity, the way people occasionally left unusual things on trails? Possible. But the carving was fresh, the cuts pale and clean, the limestone not yet weathered in the way that outdoor stone weathers, and her name was on it, and she did not know who would know to put it there. After 3 weeks, she called her daughter, Marisol, and asked if she would come with her to look at something on the trail. She didn't explain what. Marisol came on a Saturday morning, and they parked at the trailhead together and signed the register and walked the 40 minutes to the bend in the trail. The stone was there. Marisol crouched beside it and brushed the leaf litter from the cuts and read the names. She read all 13 of them without speaking. When she finished, she looked up at her mother. "That's your name," she said. Dora said she knew. Marisol photographed the stone with her phone. Multiple angles, close on the lettering, the surrounding ground, the 2 oaks framing it. She photographed each name individually. Then she stood and looked at the stone for a moment, and then at her mother, and then at the stone again, and she said, "Let's go." They walked back to the trailhead without discussing the stone. In the car, before Dora started the engine, Marisol asked how long it had been there. Dora told her she had found it 3 weeks earlier. Marisol asked why she had waited 3 weeks to come back. Dora said she had needed to decide what coming back meant. Marisol asked what it meant. Dora said she still wasn't sure. She started the car and drove home. The following week, Dora contacted the county parks office and reported the stone, its location, its dimensions, the carving, the names. She described it accurately and completely. A maintenance worker was dispatched to document it. The parks office called her 4 days later and told her the worker had located a stone matching her description and had photographed it, and that the photograph showed a natural rock formation with no carving present. Dora told them she had photographs. The parks office said they would look into it. They did not call back. Marisol's photographs showed the carving clearly. 14 names in a column. Not 13, 14. Marisol had counted them when she photographed the stone, and her photograph showed 14 names, the column extending 1 line further than Dora had read on her first visit. Marisol's name was the 14th. Cut to the same depth as the others, the same spacing, the same careful lettering. Marisol had not been to that trail before that Saturday morning. She had never been to that trail at all. She had walked the 40 minutes to the bend in the trail for the first time in her life, and her name was already there when she arrived. Dora called the park's office again and told them about the 14th name. The park's office said the maintenance worker's photograph showed a smooth stone surface. Dora asked them to send the photograph. They did not send it. The maintenance worker did not return her follow-up call. She found a stonemason through a neighbor, a retired man who had done inscription work for 40 years, cemetery monuments and building dedications and memorial plaques. She described the carving to him without showing him the photographs. He said from her description the cut sounded like chisel work, a narrow flat chisel used for lettering, the kind of tool and technique used for permanent inscription. He said there was no chalk or soft material that would produce cuts of that precision and that depth, and that whatever had been used to make the carving was the same equipment and method used for stone that was meant to last. Dora walks other trails now. Different counties, different terrain, different trailheads. She walks with Marisol when Marisol is available, and when she is not, with a neighbor who has known her for 20 years and asks no questions about why they don't walk in Carter County anymore. Dora tells her the terrain isn't worth the drive. The neighbor accepts this. It is not entirely untrue. The trail is not exceptional, and there are better trails closer to where they both live. This is what Dora tells herself when she needs a reason that is also true. She has not returned to the Carter County Trail. Not because she is afraid of the trail itself. She has said this carefully more than once to the person who collected her account. She is not afraid of the trail. She is afraid of going back and finding a 15th name. Marisol keeps the photographs on her phone in a folder behind a separate passcode, not in her main photo library. She looks at them occasionally, she says, on the days when she needs to confirm that she is not misremembering what she saw on a Saturday morning in July on a trail her mother had been walking for 30 years. The stone is in the photographs. The 14 names are in the photographs. Her name is in the photographs. She has not deleted them. Dora's name is still on the stone. She knows because she checked Marisol's photographs this morning. The stone is still there. The names are still there. And somewhere, on a trail she used to love, there is a 14th line that has been waiting, she thinks, for a very long time.